Welcome to the Western Monarch Count training videos. In this first video, we're going to give you a quick rundown on the ecology and conservation status of migratory Western monarchs. Monarchs begin their life in a small egg, which after a few days hatches, and the smallest instar caterpillar emerges. This caterpillar focuses on eating the sole host plant it can use as fuel to grow up and develop, which is the milkweed plant and the Asclepias genus and a few other related genera. That caterpillar, as it gets bigger, sheds its skin multiple times to go through each of the 5 stages or instars of being a caterpillar until it's large enough and finally forms a chrysalis. Within that chrysalis, that caterpillar undergoes transformation to become a butterfly. And once that butterfly emerges, it pretty quickly can dry its wings and is able to take off to fly, mate, find nectar, and continue the migratory journey. When monarchs are in their breeding habitat or during migration, they primarily need milkweed, that sole host plant for the caterpillars, and a plant that provides fuel for adults when it flowers, as well as many other flowers for nectar. Adults are generalists and can use a wide range of native and non-native plants that provide nectar. When they reach their overwintering grounds, they need different habitat. They need forested groves, and we think also benefit from having additional nectar, which is going to be the habitat that you're focused on when you're out counting butterflies and doing habitat assessments. So as the rest of the videos will focus more on that part of the life cycle and migratory cycle, I'm going to talk a bit about breeding habitat, which can be found across the West wherever milkweed grows. There are many different species of milkweed, upwards of 70 found in the Western United States, and they can be adapted to a wide range of habitats, including grasslands, river canyons, roadsides, and wetlands, as well as found in our urban areas. In the West, compared to the East, monarch breeding habitat is quite widespread, but it's often a lot sparser and can be harder to find and locate in these really broad areas like the Great Basin and elsewhere. But really anywhere that's not super high alpine or standing water, there is a chance that there's a milkweed adapted to that habitat type. When we zoom out and think about the migratory monarch population of North America, there are really 2 populations, and the connection between the 2 is an active area of research, including a genomic study and a lot of tagging studies that are trying to understand how they're connected. But in short, we currently understand it as an eastern population, which are butterflies that are born and raised east of the Rocky Mountains, and western migratory monarchs, which are found west of the Rocky Mountains. We know eastern monarchs overwinter in forested groves in the state of Michoacan in central Mexico, not too far from Mexico City. These butterflies can be found in the spring and summer as far north as southern Canada, which is the upper extent of where milkweed will naturally grow. And there's also a small non-migratory population in southern Florida, which relies on a non-native host plant tropical milkweed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the relationship of non-migratory monarchs to California as well. In the West, monarchs can be found in the spring and summer anywhere that milkweed grows west of the Rocky Mountains. And in the fall, they're traveling down to that coastal area, California, that stretches from about Mendocino County and the southern edge of the Redwoods down all the way into northern Baja, Mexico, with the most monarchs found in the Central Coast and the Bay Area. We know from tagging that at least some portion of Western monarchs, especially Western monarchs that are found in the Southwest, can migrate and join Eastern monarchs in central Mexico. There's certainly mixing happening at their overwintering grounds. Beyond those coastal areas where monarchs overwinter, some of our volunteers have gone out and found good numbers in Inyo County in the Saline Valley, near Death Valley in central, or in the eastern part of California. And we also know from partners at the Southwest Monarch Study in the Phoenix area that small numbers of monarchs also hang out in the deserts. The Western Monarch Count is the community science project that you're all here to learn about, and It's really volunteer powered, so thank you for joining. Your work makes all of this possible when we talk about the status of the population. So you'll learn more about the Thanksgiving count and the New Year's count in upcoming videos, but long story short, it's a great project coordinated by the Xerces Society and one of the count's co-founders, Mia Monroe, with the help of many dedicated regional coordinators and all of you, and you can learn more at westernmonarchcount.org. Based on the data you all generate, we're able to track the population over time since the count's inception in 1997. The green line on this graph shows the number of monarchs that were counted or estimated by our volunteers over time. So you can see a steep decline from the late 90s to the early 2020s. And then you can compare that with the number of sites counted, which is a measure of volunteer effort, which has been really rapidly increasing over time in the last decade. That's the blue line showing that we are now counting over 200 or 250 sites most of our years in the recent past. But because we know volunteer effort is varied over time and not all sites are created equal, we can use some fancy statistics like Schultz et al. Did to actually look back in time and estimate a more standardized version of the population size. They used Western Monarch count data, and for the 1980s and early 90s, comparable data generated at fewer sites by professional biologists to come up with estimates. These estimates fit what newspaper clippings and other published reports estimated the number of butterflies in the 80s and before that were found each winter along the California coast, which is low millions of butterflies regularly found. We saw a big decline in the 90s, which actually spurred the formation of the Western Monarch count because some of those biologists were really concerned that they were seeing declines and wanted a better way to document what they were seeing. We did see a bounce back in 1997 that we think was a relatively high year. But if we look back over time, we know that that wasn't an unusually high year when we compare it to the 1980s. But from about the year 2000 onward, we've seen just low hundreds of thousands of butterflies most years until the most recent few years where the population dropped even further to just a few thousand butterflies. Last year in 2021, we saw relative return to normal with about 250,000 monarchs counted. And so we know even if we zoom out and count last year's count as our new normal, we estimate a 95% population decline. So we know that these butterflies are in trouble, but why they're in trouble is an area that we are still examining, and we're thinking about the solutions we can take, even if we don't know all the reasons why we got here today with this population. Currently, the conservation status in California is the monarch is a species of greatest conservation need, and according to California's Department of Fish and Wildlife, it's a special status invertebrate. Federally, monarchs are a candidate species under the Endangered Species Act, and we expect a final listing decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service in fiscal year 2024. At an international level, a nonprofit, the IUCN, has recently listed the monarch as endangered on their red list. This has no legal ramifications, but is another example of widespread agreement that this butterfly is in trouble and needs our help. Monarchs aren't the only butterfly declining. Many other butterflies are also declining. In California, there are 15 federally listed butterfly species, and work out of UC Davis, University of Nevada, Reno, and others have shown widespread declines in many groups of Western monarchs or Western butterflies, including monarchs. And many of these declines have been associated with things like habitat loss, pesticides, but also the increasing threat of climate change and specifically warmer fall temps. When it comes to monarchs, we think that there are a lot of different factors at play, and there's good, healthy debate about exactly the relative weight of these different factors, but a lot of consensus that some of the main threats to them are the loss and degradation of their overwintering habitat in coastal California and elsewhere, loss and degradation of their breeding and migratory habitat, which can be found widespread across the West, pesticides, including herbicides, which kill plants, insecticides, which kill insects, and other chemicals. Climate change, which we think is making it harder for these butterflies, especially in the face of these other threats. And we also know that other factors might play a role, but we may know less about their population level impacts, including the parasite OE and non-native predators. the loss of overwintering habitat will be an issue that you all as volunteers will be very much in the forefront of when it comes to documenting when you're out to count butterflies or do a habitat assessment. We know conservatively we've lost over 60 sites in the past 30 years due to development, wildfire, excessive trimming and removal of trees. We continue to lose sites every year, and a lot of this is driven by a lack of awareness of the habitat value, especially on non-native trees like eucalyptus. There's also a lack of awareness of the existing legal protections, which are still insufficient. This includes groves that are found within the coastal zone of California, at least on paper, have protections under the California Coastal Commission's definitions of environmentally sensitive habitat areas, but there's a little acknowledgement of this and enforcement at local levels. We also know that there are many sites outside of that coastal zone, and sometimes when those sites are threatened, we have few legal paths to prevent it. Another factor in the loss of overwintering habitat is even if a landowner or manager knows the value of these trees, there can often be a lot of other people that have the ability to come in and trim trees like utilities, other rights of ways like roadsides and neighbors. So often there's a lot of people that you have to inform and get on the same page about protecting habitat, or we risk losing trees like this site in Ventura, where trees were removed that were once hosting thousands of butterflies. Switching gears to the loss of breeding habitat. The loss of breeding habitat has been heavily implicated in the decline of the eastern monarchs. But out here in the West, we think it's a little bit more nuanced. We haven't had quite the land conversion to row crops as we've seen in the upper Midwest, which is the heart of the summer breeding range for eastern monarchs. But in the West, we've seen the degradation of habitat in other ways. And so anytime we lose native milkweed, we lose nectar plants, which again is a really wide bucket. There are a lot of different plants that monarchs use. Or we see that that habitat is contaminated from pesticides or high levels of pathogens. We know that we could have lost some monarch habitat. And we're losing this in our agricultural areas. Here's an aerial shot of the Central Valley of California, which has become increasingly monoculture, and even weedy margins are often rare now. And then also our urban, suburban, and exurban development and how we're managing a lot of our landscapes to not include wildness and plants that host butterflies. So there's very much a need to rewild at multiple scales. On the left, we have a farm field in the Central Valley that Xerces is working with to plant a native hedgerow. It's early on in the planting. Those plants are quite small, if you can see them in the photo. And on the right, we have an example of a much more mature hedgerow where you have a lot of flowering plants that are providing host plants, nectar plants, and corridors for bees, for butterflies, and for birds and other wildlife to move through the landscape. In urban areas, we know we can work with much smaller areas, and there's a lot we can do creatively. Even when we think about areas that are paved or there's asphalt, we can put out pots and create temporary resources, especially when monarchs are in the area. The risk of pesticides is also an area of active research, but there has been good documentation that herbicides remove those larval host plants, those milkweeds, as well as nectar plants from the landscape, again, heavily implicated in eastern monarchs' decline. We think a little more of a complicated story in the West. But there's also been good work by the University of Nevada, Reno and Xerces, who've put out multiple studies looking at contamination of milkweeds that are out there in our retail nurseries for people to purchase and already on the landscape in a wide variety of habitats, and shown that there are really high levels of contamination of those plants because of our widespread over-reliance on pesticides. So whenever we can reduce our reliance, especially for aesthetic reasons or non-economic or health reasons, that can be the lowest hanging fruit to reduce risk and exposure to all of these beneficial insects. And we can also think about the trade-offs, especially when it comes to using alternative methods of pest control and thinking about the short-term and long-term risks of these chemicals, even if they're short-term gain for other purposes. So those are kind of the big factors that we have a fair amount of evidence of their role in the decline of migratory monarchs. Another one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I think the literature is still really evolving, but we know climate change is probably making things worse. It's not the only reason why we've gotten to where we've gotten today. But we know things like more severe winter storms, drought-stressed trees at their overwintering groves, wildfire can play both positive and a negative role, and the warming temperatures and more extreme weather events could also be stressing these populations. Another factor that there's a growing body of evidence showing could be having a negative impact to migratory monarchs is the protozoan parasite OE. If you want to learn more, I recommend checking out Project Monarch Health's website. They're a great community science project and research group at the University of Georgia. We think that OE rates have been increasing in migratory monarch populations, and including in coastal areas of California in recent years due to the widespread planting of a non-native milkweed, tropical milkweed, which goes by many names, but the scientific name is Asclepias carasavica, which combined with warming temps has led to the increase in the number of resident monarchs or monarchs that aren't migrating, but are instead hanging out often in urban gardens on this plant, which can tend to lead to really high rates of this protozoan parasite because native milkweeds tend to die back in the fall and break the disease cycle. The tropical milkweed continues to be evergreen and can lead to really high rates of this OE parasite. So again, this is an area of active research to try and understand the relative risks of this plant and its effect on migration and OE rates. So conservatively, when we think about the precautionary principle, until we know more, at Xerces, we recommend trying to plant native milkweed instead of tropical milkweed, especially if you live in areas with a mild winter. And if you already have tropical milkweed, consider cutting it back to the ground in the fall to break that disease cycle and to make it act more like native milkweed. Besides those two items, there are other factors that we know could be out there affecting these populations, including the impacts of non-native predators, which we think are probably playing a role, at least in local population dynamics. And we often hear folks reach out to us with concerns about the levels of predation they see in their home gardens or their local milkweed patch. But whether or not these factors really have a population level impact is yet to be determined. So I talked a lot about the threats of why we got here. And the good news is I think there are a lot of different ways that you all can become part of the solution. Being a volunteer for this project is a great one. If you want some other ideas, participating in the restoration and protection of overwintering habitat, the migratory and breeding habitat, reducing the risk from pesticides, and participating in other community science and research projects, as well as advocating and voting to do things that help protect and fund monarchs and other insects conservation. In terms of restoring overwintering habitat, there's a lot of really engaged overwintering managers who are going to use the information you all gather to help inform their efforts to restore these groves of trees, which need really active management, especially when we're dealing with groves that are often impacted by things like disease and drought and in small urban areas and are limited by urban interfaces. On the left is an example of state parks investing at the Monarch Overwintering Grove and putting a restoration plan into action by planting additional trees and irrigating them. And on the right, we have Plaskett Creek Campground, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And we've got a fire crew out planting native Monterey cypress and pine to restore a windrow that was taken down in the past that we know could really help create more of a wind buffer for some of the overwintering monarchs at that site in Big Sur. In terms of breeding and migratory habitat, this is where I think pretty much everyone can be part of the solution. Again, if you have a natural area, if you can talk to a school or organization that you support and think about trying to get more native plants back on the landscape or even within your own garden, you can plant plants. There's a wide variety of nectar that they're going to use, and then a wide variety of milkweeds that they can also use. So you can find something that's local and available for your area. And these smiling faces are all kit recipients for Xerces Habitat Kits, where we give away these kits not to private individuals, but to groups that have a plan to put them in the ground. In terms of reducing pesticide use and the risks that puts out there in the world to other wildlife, including monarchs. You can buy Bee Safe plants, which are plants that have fewer contamination issues. And you can learn more on our website by seeking out nurseries that have taken pledges like being neonic free or certified organic. Besides the Western Monarch count, I'll plug another community science project, the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, which tracks monarchs outside of the overwintering season and outside of the overwintering groves. So anywhere in the West where people see milkweeds or monarchs at any life stage, they can report them. And we have a really nice project within iNaturalist. So if you already use iNaturalist on your phone, you can just put your reporting in your phone and then tag the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project. And each spring, there's an extra special push by Washington State University called the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge to collect even more of those records as monarchs leave the overwintering grounds. It's when the population is at its smallest, we know the least about where they are or where they're going. So all that data ends up back in our Mapper project, but you can check out the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge to be entered for things like prizes and social media recognition. And finally, we have a ton more information on our website, xerces.org. You can also search Xerces and monarchs and come up with some of our key pages that provide free things like nectar plant lists, guidance on overwintering habitat management, how to collect your own milkweed seed. You can check out our milkweed seed finder where you can find local vendors of native milkweed. You can also apply to our habitat kit program. And if you're an educator or have young ones in your life, we have a new program called X Kids that provide resources in English and Spanish to get kids excited about insects. And with that, there are a lot of other good places to find monarch information out there, but two I'd plug is the Western Monarch Conservation Plan, which was written by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. If you really want a deep dive about conservation issues and solutions for the West, that plan is kind of a one-stop shop. And Monarch Joint Venture, which is another nonprofit that runs some great community science projects and also organizes a lot of vision around how we all want to communicate and tackle important research and habitat questions. They've got seminar series, handouts, things like that. So their website's just a wealth of information if you want to check out monarchjointventure.org. And with that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your training videos.